The moment I handed my son the keys to the house I had built with my own hands, I felt proud in the way a man feels when he believes he has finally done something right for his family. It was a mild afternoon, the kind that sits somewhere between late summer and early fall, when the air carries a faint smell of dry leaves but the sun still lingers warm on the siding of the house. The maple tree out front was beginning to turn, just a few orange edges showing along the tips of the leaves. I remember that clearly because my daughter-in-law pointed at it and said it would look beautiful from the kitchen window once autumn came. The house had stood there since 1974. I knew the year without thinking because I had written it inside the breaker box when we finished the wiring. My wife and I had slept on a mattress on the floor the first night after moving in. No curtains yet, no proper table, just a small radio playing quietly while trucks hummed on the highway a mile away. By the time of that afternoon decades later, the place had grown old along with me. The porch boards creaked a little more than they used to. The kitchen clock ticked louder than it probably needed to. The refrigerator had that low mechanical hum older appliances make, steady as breathing. My son Daniel stood beside me at the kitchen table while the lawyer arranged papers in neat stacks. Blue ink pens. Yellow legal pads. A briefcase that smelled faintly of leather and dust. Just some paperwork, Daniel had told me earlier that week over the phone. Tax purposes mostly. Makes things easier down the road. He said it casually, the way people say things when they already believe the matter is settled. I trusted him. That was the simple truth of it. You don't spend 30 years raising a boy, teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway, watching him graduate high school in a suit that fits a little awkward around the shoulders, only to imagine he might be steering you wrong in your old age. The lawyer slid the first document across the table. I remember the sound of the paper moving against the wood. Soft. Final. Just sign here, Mr. Carter. My hand trembled a little, but that had been happening lately anyway. Age does that. The blue ink flowed smoothly across the line. My name looked older than I remembered it. Daniel smiled when I finished. It was the same smile he'd had when he was 10 years old and brought home a perfect report card. See? That wasn't so bad, he said. My daughter-in-law Linda poured coffee into 3 paper cups she had picked up from a diner on the way over. The coffee was already cooling by the time I took a sip, but I drank it anyway. The kitchen clock ticked loudly on the wall. The lawyer gathered the documents, slid them into his briefcase, and shook my hand. Everything's in order, he said. After he left, the house felt strangely quiet. Not empty exactly, just paused. Linda started talking about repainting the hallway. Daniel walked through the living room measuring the space with his eyes like he was imagining furniture that hadn't arrived yet. At the time I thought it was excitement. Young people planning things. Looking back now, I suppose it was something else. But hindsight has a way of making things clearer than they were. That evening we celebrated. Daniel picked up a roast chicken from the grocery store. Linda set the table with plates from the cabinet my wife had chosen years earlier. The good plates, the ones with the blue rim. The 3 of us sat together while the late news murmured from the television in the other room. I remember the smell of the chicken, the soft clink of forks against porcelain, the steady ticking of that kitchen clock that always seemed louder at night. Dad, Daniel said halfway through dinner, we've been thinking. That sentence is one that can lead anywhere. He told me his cousin in Arizona had been asking about me for years. Said it might be nice for me to visit for a while. Warmer weather. A change of pace. Linda nodded. Just a short trip, she said. You deserve a little break. I laughed at that. A break from what? Retirement had already turned most of my days into quiet stretches of coffee, newspaper pages, and the occasional walk to the hardware store just to talk to someone. Still, the idea didn't seem strange. Families suggest things for each other all the time. Why not? I said. Daniel offered to drive me to the airport that night. Said flights were cheaper if you booked late. I packed a small suitcase. One of those old vinyl ones with the worn handle that bends slightly when you lift it. 2 shirts. A sweater. My winter coat folded carefully over my arm. Before we left, I walked through the house once more out of habit. Not because I thought anything of it. Just the small rituals a man develops after living somewhere for so long. The living room lamp cast a yellow circle on the carpet. The hallway smelled faintly of furniture polish. The kitchen sink held 3 rinsed plates drying on the rack. I turned off the lights. Daniel carried my suitcase to the car. The drive to the airport took about 40 minutes. We talked about ordinary things, traffic, gas prices, a baseball game playing on the radio. The terminal glowed under bright fluorescent lights when we pulled up. Inside, everything hummed softly. Rolling suitcases. Distant announcements echoing across the high ceiling. Payphones mounted along the wall near the departure gates. Daniel walked me to the security line. Linda hugged me. "Call when you land," she said. I promised I would. Daniel squeezed my shoulder. "Love you, Dad." Then they turned and walked away toward the parking garage. I remember watching them go for a moment, thinking how strange it felt that the house would be theirs now. But families grow. Houses pass from one generation to the next. That's the way things are supposed to go. I picked up my suitcase and walked slowly toward gate 14. The plastic chair beneath the departure sign felt cold when I sat down. People moved around me in quiet currents, travelers with briefcases, children holding stuffed animals, a woman drinking coffee from a paper cup while staring out at the runway. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above. I looked down at my boarding pass. Then I looked again. And for the first time that evening, something inside my chest shifted in a way I couldn't quite name. The gate agent's voice drifted through the speakers somewhere above my head while I sat there studying that boarding pass, turning it slowly between my fingers like it might change if I looked at it from a different angle. Phoenix. One way. That part made sense. Daniel had mentioned Arizona. But there was something about the date that felt odd. Not wrong exactly, just unfinished. No return flight. No second page tucked behind the first. Airline tickets used to come in little paper folders back then, with neat perforated edges. When you traveled round trip, there were always 2 coupons. I flipped through the envelope again. Just the one. Around me the airport hummed the way airports always do, not loud, but constant. Rolling luggage wheels. Someone coughing 2 rows over. A soda machine clicking as it dropped a can into the tray. I checked the time on the big clock above the gate. 20 minutes until boarding. It occurred to me then that Daniel hadn't mentioned when I'd be coming home. That thought didn't scare me right away. It just settled somewhere in the back of my mind like a loose nail in a floorboard. I stood up and walked over to the payphones along the wall. They were lined up in a row, each one mounted in a metal box with a small shelf beneath the receiver. I set my suitcase down beside my shoes and dug a few coins from my coat pocket. The phone rang 3 times before the answering machine picked up. It was Daniel's voice on the recording. "Hi, you've reached Daniel and Linda. Leave a message." I didn't leave one. I hung up gently and stood there for a moment, holding the receiver before setting it back in place. Maybe they were still driving. Maybe traffic was bad leaving the airport. Back then you didn't expect people to answer every call. Phones rang in empty houses all the time. I told myself that. I walked back to my seat. The chair felt colder the second time. A man in a gray suit sat across from me reading a newspaper. A young mother bounced a baby on her knee. Somewhere down the terminal a janitor pushed a wide mop across the polished floor. My coffee from earlier had followed me in my stomach, turning slightly bitter now that it had cooled. The announcement came. Flight 417 to Phoenix now boarding. People stood. Jackets rustled. Suitcases lifted. I remained seated for a moment longer. Not because I had decided anything yet, just because my legs didn't feel quite ready to move. That loose nail in the floorboard of my thoughts began to wiggle a little harder. I remembered the way Daniel had walked through the living room earlier that afternoon, measuring things with his eyes. I remembered Linda talking about repainting the hallway. I remembered the lawyer closing his briefcase. Little moments that had seemed harmless when they happened. Memory has a way of rearranging itself once the truth begins to surface. Finally I stood and joined the line. The plane itself was small. 2 seats on each side of the aisle. The kind where the overhead bins always looked slightly too narrow for the luggage people insisted on carrying aboard. I took the window seat. The vinyl cushion squeaked faintly when I sat down. Outside the window the runway light stretched into the dark like a quiet row of candles. A stewardess walked past offering magazines. I took one without really seeing the cover. When the engine started, the vibration moved through the floor and into my feet. That was when the realization finally settled into place. Not like a lightning strike. More like a door quietly closing somewhere behind you. They hadn't sent me on a visit. They had moved me out of the life I'd been living. And they had done it politely. Paperwork for taxes. A little trip. A suitcase. By the time the plane lifted off, I understood. The strange thing is that I didn't cry. I've thought about that many times over the years. People imagine moments like that come with shouting or anger or tears. But the truth is quieter. I just sat there watching the runway lights shrink beneath the wing, feeling something inside me grow very still. Grief sometimes arrives without noise. Phoenix was warm when I stepped off the plane the next morning. The desert air had a dry smell to it, like warm dust and sun-baked pavement. My cousin Robert met me outside baggage claim. He looked older than I remembered, but then again so did I. Danny said you might stay a while, he told me as he lifted my suitcase into the trunk of his car. That sentence explained more than he realized. Robert and his wife had a small guest room. I stayed there for several weeks at first. I called Daniel 3 times during that period. The answering machine picked up every time. After the 3rd call, I stopped trying. Not because I was angry. Just because some things become clearer when you allow silence to answer for people. Those first months were strange. When you lose a home late in life, it isn't just the building that disappears. It's the rhythm of your days. The creak of the same step on the staircase. The way the morning light lands on the kitchen counter. The familiar path your feet take from bedroom to coffee pot before you're fully awake. All of that had been quietly erased. For a while I felt like a man who had misplaced himself. But life has a stubborn habit of continuing. Robert helped me find a small apartment a few blocks from a grocery store and a diner that opened before sunrise. I bought a second-hand chair for the living room and a cheap radio that picked up the local stations. The place smelled faintly of fresh paint and carpet glue. It wasn't the house I built in 1974. But it was mine. In the mornings I walked to the diner and ordered coffee in a thick white mug. The waitress learned my name after the first couple weeks. In the afternoons I volunteered at a hardware store owned by a man who needed help organizing the back shelves. Turns out decades of fixing things around your own house leaves you with useful habits. Days stacked into weeks. Weeks into years. Something inside me slowly rebuilt itself, not the same structure as before, but steady enough to stand. Every now and then I would think about the house. About the maple tree in front. About the kitchen clock ticking loudly on the wall. And about Daniel. I never told anyone in Arizona the full story. Not out of shame, but because it didn't seem necessary. People carry many things quietly. Time has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of memory. The anger never really arrived. What replaced it instead was a sort of understanding, not approval, but recognition. Families are made of flawed people trying to manage their own fears. Maybe Daniel believed he was doing something practical. Maybe Linda worried about the burden of an aging father living under the same roof. I'll probably never know. What I do know is that dignity isn't something another person can take from you unless you hand it over. And I decided not to. Years later, on a winter evening, I was sitting in my small apartment with a cup of coffee growing cold beside the radio when the phone rang. A voice on the other end hesitated before speaking. "Dad?" It was Daniel. Older. Slower. For a moment neither of us said anything. Then I leaned back in the chair, looking out the window at the desert sky turning dark, and answered in the calmest voice I could manage. "Hello, son."